We're going to get started. Welcome. My name is Danny Shafson, and I am, along with Lisa Martin, one of the two co-chairs of the CLIA New Clinicians Conference. We are thrilled to have a great group with us this morning for our second plenary session entitled Racial Justice in the Classroom and in Practice. Just some quick housekeeping announcements. The session is going to be recorded, and I think we have started recording again, so you are welcome to keep your video off if you are comfortable. Just know that the session is being recorded, and we ask you also to keep your sound on mute, your microphone on mute throughout the session. A reminder that the small groups are going to be meeting after this session starting at 12:45 p.m. Eastern. If you don't know your group, we ask that you email Lisa Martin, and we're going to put Lisa's email in the chat so you can see it if you don't have it. A reminder that there are 3 asynchronous videos that are posted to the CLIA website and the CLIA YouTube page. Those asynchronous videos are on scholarship, the lay of the land, and the Teaching Academy. They are excellent, and we hope you will take a look at some later point, not right now. And also a reminder that we are posting as we go session materials to a Google Drive that we have created for the conference, and we are also going to paste a link to the Google Drive in the chat now and throughout the session. If you want to ask a question, we're going to be monitoring the chat. We will make sure the presenters are going to be presenting, so they may not see the questions right away. We will try to share questions with them so that they can address them during the flow of the presentation or afterwards. But apologies in advance to any questions we don't get to. It is not personal. We're going to try to make sure every question gets answered, but feel free to put questions in the chat along the way. Now, I want to introduce our speakers for this morning. The first is Priya Baskaran, who is an assistant professor of law and the director of the Entrepreneurship Law Clinic at American University's Washington College of Law. Professor Baskaran focuses on economic justice and transactional law. Our second presenter is Professor Alexi Freeman, who is the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Director of Social Justice Initiatives at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Professor Freeman is an externship clinician overseeing one of the country's largest externship programs, and also teaches a movement lawyering practicum at the University of Denver. Alexis Karteron, our third presenter, is an associate professor of law and the director of constitutional rights, the Constitutional Rights Clinic at Rutgers Law School. Professor Karteron's clinic focuses on civil rights issues related to mass incarcerations, and she also teaches courses on policing and education law. And last but certainly not least, Professor Brendan Roediger is a professor of law and the director of the Civil Litigation Clinic at St. Louis University School of Law. Professor Roediger's current work focuses on pretrial detention and on sexual violence and incarceration. Please join me in welcoming a fantastic group of presenters for our Racial Justice in the Classroom and in Practice plenary session.
One small correction, Danny. Actually, it's Alexi who's going first. And I'm going second. But Alexi. We're often confused for each other because we're both just so good looking. So it happens.
Alexi, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, I think I am successfully unmuted. Yes, I hope. Okay, awesome. Thanks so much for having me, and it's great to see such a large group of folks joining the clinical community. We need all the people we can get at every law school in the country doing this work, especially now, and I think you all are really lucky to be already a part of the sort of CLIA family, which has been, I think, super supportive and is a super great brain trust for everyone. So welcome, and excited to talk with you a little bit today. Full disclosure, I have been suffering from migraines the last 2 weeks, so I am a little this is very fancy for me the last couple of weeks, so I apologize if I'm a little slower, which maybe is good because I'm a fast talker, but I'm just a little bit off my game. So nevertheless, excited to be here. It's been a rough couple of weeks. So as Danny mentioned, I wear a few different hats at the law school, and namely today I'm going to talk about my role as externship clinician, because I think that makes the most sense for the audience here. For clarity, externships are obviously where students work in the field under legal supervisor, and then we as externship faculty provide faculty oversight and kind of follow the similar plan, do, reflect model that in-house clinicians follow. And as Danny mentioned, DU does have one of the largest programs in the country. And why I think that's relevant is because externship programs come in all shapes and sizes, and there are very different levels of flexibility, different levels of status of the people teaching these courses, and all of that affects the choices, right, that we as externship faculty get to make. So I come from a school that's very supported, right? I'm a contract faculty member. I'm now an associate dean. These are things that don't happen at every school. So while DU has many ways to grow, to be clear, I do think we've been afforded some power, for lack of a better word, that other externship clinicians do not have. So I just want to share that because I do think that that matters and how we get to do the work that we want to do. With that said, I think, I don't know how any course, any program, et cetera, within legal education doesn't address issues of race. Race is, I don't think you can talk or analyze anything as it relates to legal education, the law, policy, our profession without discussing race on both the individual and structural level, but yet we know this happens all the time, right, in legal academy. And I think we can do a much better job of centering equity, inclusion, anti-racism work. For externships, I think one of the challenges is that we don't have the same layer and level of control as comparison to in-house clinicians, who I'm sure also don't think they have all the control because, clients and everything, politics, things affect the work. But I think in externship world, you have to think about what can you control, right? Because you can't necessarily control everything that the supervisor is giving the student. You can't control the climate, right, that the student is in. So all of these things make it, I think, more complicated to do the work in some ways. So I'm going to share, I think, what are some things that we can do to insert and elevate race in the spaces that we do control. The first thing, which I find so simplistic, but in my discussions with students this year, it seems that this is not happening. And I say this discussions with students, not only at DU. I think the biggest thing is we need to literally acknowledge the world that we are in, right? And that requires knowing what's going on nationally, but also in your local community, also in your school community. There are often things around race that are occurring within the legal building that sometimes professors are completely unaware of. And I think it's important to be aware of these things and then raise them, offer time to discuss them, whether as a group, personal, et cetera. And the default seems to be, and I don't know if this is the default in the clinician world, most likely less so, but the default is that most professors don't do this. I mean, there are a number of students who've been in crim law this year and have not discussed race. And I do not understand in 2021 how you can be in a crim law class and not discuss race. But yet this has happened repeatedly in law schools across the country. So we, I think as clinicians, while we cannot be the only folks who talk about race, I think we certainly have to. I also think we can include language around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, anti-racism, et cetera, in our actual syllabi, right? And be really explicit about our policies, procedures, our philosophies. What are they, right? And it can be our own beliefs, right? We don't have to say this is what the law school believes or this is, a stated fact in the profession. I think that's when we can get a little people thinking that we have, we're promoting certain ideas and not promoting others. But I do think just like we talk about religious accommodations or disability accommodations, we should bring up diversity and race in our paperwork. This one is sort of a tried and true, but I think we need to be thoughtful about the who behind our assignments, the who behind our literature, the who behind our guest speakers, representation by identity, as well as by discipline. So my students never read only things by lawyers. They never read only things by white lawyers. They never read only things, they read things by organizers, right? They read things by people who are part of different minoritized groups. And relatedly, in externships, one of the decision points, I think, is that you can make a decision as to whether students can ever work under the supervision of non-lawyers. At DU, we allow this. Now, there has to be, of course, you can't be practicing law, right, if you're not supervised by a lawyer, but you certainly can learn a lot from grassroots organizers, right, and policy advocates. And this expands students' understanding, right, of race, because these folks tend to center race better than lawyers. And it expands their understanding of just social change more generally, right, which, of course, is tied to race. But externship decision, a lot of externships don't allow that, right? And I think that is a limited view, right, of how we can lawyer. Also, I forgot to do my time. So if someone could give me a reminder when I have about 5 minutes, I forgot to press my thing. That's the headache, I think. The other thing I think is that we in externships worlds, you're not only are you navigating students, you're also navigating supervisors, right? Some of whom are into these issues, some of whom are not, right? Some of whom are well-versed, some of whom are not. We include in all of our supervisory material, all of our trainings, explicit language around DEI, around anti-racism, et cetera. We don't require supervisors to necessarily believe everything that we espouse, but we put what we espouse on paper, right? And then just like we talk about sexual harassment, we talk about what we expect as it relates to inclusion. In all of my years here, we've had 1 or 2 supervisors. And if you look at the offices, you know exactly who would be the person, right? Or the office that would push back against either one of these things. And it's the same office that's pushed back against both. And that's it, right? That's the only, that's the only office that has ever said anything about being concerned part of our program. I think sometimes we're nervous, right? Because we rely on supervisors to give our students opportunities, but we can push them, right? And our students want to push them too, right? So I think there's a fine line, but I think we have to sort of put what we believe a little bit more forward. One of the things I think that we do a lot in our classes, doesn't necessarily happen in the offices, but we promote it in our classes, is a lot of work around communications, narrative, and messaging, right? Now, a lot of people don't necessarily think this is important for lawyering, but it's so important, right? It's important for how you write it in the complaint. It's important for the press release, all these different things. And I've also found that a lot of what people believe around race is from the media. It's from what they hear. That's not from reading the complaint, right? So I think it's really important for lawyers to understand, right, that their words, their messaging matters, right? And if we look at, the opportunity agenda, Rinku Sen, right, narrative initiative, there are people who are scholars on this work. So I think it's our job, again, what can we as externship clinicians control to bring in communications, right? To bring in messaging and to bring in these things really explicitly around race, wherever you're working, right? Whether it's pro bono, public sector, whatever, because they're not getting that in their placement, but that's something we can offer. I also ask my students to foster dialogue with their supervisors, right? Which is a clear tenet of externship work. Students tend to say, yeah, I'll talk to my supervisor about my assignment, but they don't really think about anything else. But I am very explicit about what topics they should talk about. So this year, a lot of it was focused on current events, right? What do they feel their obligation is as lawyers in their profession, in their office, et cetera, to ask them if they're responding to the current racial unrest, advocacy, et cetera. And there were some really interesting dialogues that resulted, some that gave students faith in our system and profession, and some that did not. And that is a learning tool, right? So I think that's been really important. And I think it's also important to think about how we talk about these issues, how we raise them, what are the risks, and talking to students about that, because we don't want students to become lawyers and then never be willing to have such conversations with their team members. So we can start to train them now. I think I have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to do just 2 more examples. One of the things that we do in our externship seminars is give a lot of hypos and scenarios, right? Which I'm sure is what a lot of people do in different clinical courses. But when I ask them to look at scenarios, I have them, what would you do, right? As a lawyer in this setting, et cetera. And then I say, what would you do as a lawyer if you were focused on building power, if you were focused on elevating race, right? The answer is not always the same. The gut reaction of the lawyer is not necessarily to build power, right? But if we force them to think about looking at problems and complex problem solving in different ways by centering race, by elevating community, then all of a sudden they're thinking about their tools and their strategies with different lights, right? With a different lens. And again, I don't think this is happening at every office. So it's something that we can add. And then the last example I'll mention, or maybe 2 more. One is self-assessment. It's very, very clear, right? We need to have students examine biases, examine their skills, examine where they're comfortable. It forces them to acknowledge what they don't know as it relates to these issues. And then second step is to create a plan, right? On how to improve, how to move forward. The last one I want to mention is many of us in clinicians, whether in clinics or in externships, are working with aspiring prosecutors or aspiring public defenders. Or defense attorneys more generally. I have taught a class or multiple classes of these groups together. This can be very challenging, right? But it is something that a lot of externship clinicians have to do because we don't have the resources to divide them. What I do about that class is I'm not talking about trial advocacy, right? I'm not talking about those things. They're getting that training in their own offices with the framework that those offices want. Instead, what I do is we talk about criminal justice reform, right? Because I go in there saying the system is maybe working the way it's been designed, but it's not a good way of working, right? So I have them read things, abolition, around Paul Butler's ideas around affirmative action, right? What the reforms going on in Philly, in Dallas, right? All these things. This summer we read statements after what did people say after the killing of George Floyd? we took away the identities, right? And then so students would say, oh my God, this is what my DA said. This is awful. Yep, right? So again, these are ways that we can elevate race, things that they can then go back to their supervisors and say, I read the statement, right? I was a little surprised that you said it this way. What's the office's framework? These are things that are really important for their growth and for figuring out their best fit. And I think that's what externships can do. Where can the heart, right, meet the hands, meet the head? And I think if we don't push them to think about all these things, then they will just go along like a normal internship. And we have a real luxury, I think, to force them to elevate these issues. So that was probably pretty fast, but hopefully a good amount of nuggets to help people along. I don't remember who is going next, but I will punt to my next presenter.
That would be me. I'm gonna actually, thank you for that, Alexi. That was super helpful. I want to pull from some of the themes that you've brought up. This is my moment to let you know that I am a millennial. So of course I have slides. So please bear with me. Can everyone see my slides? I'll take a thumbs up for my fellow panelists who are at the top. Okay, great. So I want to pick up on some themes that Alexi laid out, specifically, expectations within the larger curriculum of whether or not people engage in racial justice and actually cover the topics and the challenges that come out of that, and specific strategies that we can sort of use to do this work in clinic, even if the rest of the curriculum within the law school has not kind of explicitly touched on it. And then I really want to drive home on this idea of who are we including in these conversations in terms of clients, in terms of the readings we assign, and in terms of the partners that we choose to work with. And I'm going to demonstrate this within transactional clinics because I am a transactional clinician. I've only been in a courtroom like 4 times, 3 times to get sworn into the bar and 1 time to get married, right? So I, like even in the transactional clinical space, which is not a space that it is maybe as explicit as obvious as in the immigration clinic space or the criminal justice space, there is ample room for this, and we should at this very critical juncture be engaged in this work. In terms of my clinic, which is a brand new clinic, we just finished our first year of operation because I'm new to American, I have the following broad programmatic and learning goals. So as a clinical program, American University is heavily engaged in social justice curriculum. And as part of this, we are committed to an anti-racist and intersectional pedagogy. And so within transactional clinics, often this takes the form of really talking about economic justice and the ways in which all of the things like sort of within our capitalist framework can still incorporate elements of this, and also like explicit discussions of post-capitalism, like what happens afterwards, right? And is there an opportunity to use like that framework to talk explicitly about race, gender, sexual orientation, class, geography, haves and have-nots. And as part of this, one of our goals in clinic is obviously critical thinking. And I need my students to understand critical thinking beyond unleashing your inner 1L issue spotting monster, right? Because you can write an algorithm for that and LegalZoom will replace you, right? But your understanding of like structural issues of like what has historically, policy, legally, intersection of statutes that are not necessarily copacetic have created these like compound oppressions. That is vital. That is what an algorithm is not going to be able to really be able to think through. And that's what leads to what we're really paid to do as transactional lawyers, which is think about innovation. And I want innovation that's anchored in solidarity, that's anchored in something that's going to move us forward as a society towards greater economic justice. Right? So in this way, we frame both the importance of why we need this anti-racist and intersectional pedagogy, that's anchored, right, in an understanding of, interlocking systems of subordination, and how you, as the next generation of lawyers, really need to think about things innovatively rather than just thinking about, okay, this is like what the securities regulations say, so this is all I can do. Again, LegalZoom has a form for that. So how are you going to actually create solutions? Now, that's the goal, and it's not without challenges, right? Most of the students who take my clinic are interested in being transactional lawyers, they're interested in being business lawyers. Their expectation is they're going to do transactional legal work. They are not necessarily primed to have conversations about economic justice, right, or inequality, to have conversations about race, about, things like that. And so I have to sort of think critically about how to buttress that in order to work against those expectations, right? Particularly, I'm still on the tenure track. I'm junior. Course evaluations have real consequences, right, for my job security. So I have to incorporate that into my course design, right? And I have to accept, sort of what Alexi had talked about, which is that it's not a given that the other classes that they've taken before coming into my class, business associations or securities regulations or contracts, will have talked about, we'll have talked about this, right? We'll have talked about, the racially restrictive covenants, right, as a form of, business contract, right, that is like intended to prevent, economic equality along the lines of race, right? So, I have to also remember that they're not primed for that. So how am I going to work that in there? And then, of course, and I think Brendan is going to talk about this later, it's the reality of time pressures. I have a semester-long clinic. It's 14 weeks, it's 7 credits. There's only so much that I can do. So we're constantly playing this balancing game of, am I focusing on skills? Am I focusing on, reflection? Am I focusing on substantive law because I can't guarantee that everybody has the same background, right? Or familiarity with the business law topics. And like, I obviously, need students to be able to grapple with issues of racial justice, right? So we're constantly thinking about all this. So, here are my solutions that I have been implementing this year and that I think have worked relatively well. The first is think critically, and again, Alexis is going to talk about this more, about the cases that you pick, right? So I pick cases where my clients are social enterprises, triple bottom line businesses, or sort of like innovative community organizations that don't kind of neatly fit into the 501c3 nonprofit organization box, that are doing work to solve things like food insecurity, to deal with collateral consequences for returning citizens around employment, right? And the work we're doing for them is very like standard business law work. It might be, okay, I'm trying to raise some money. I've got somebody who's going to give me a loan. So we're going to do all of the standard transactional business lawyering that makes my students so excited, but they're learning about the issues about like systemic injustice from their clients, and that gives us a platform using rounds, right? Using supervision, using reflection to dive deeper into these topics. And you can do the same with project-based representation. I want to shout out Law for Black Lives, which has done a lot of work with transactional clinics and sort of like policy research, which is also a great way to sort of immerse students in it if you find yourself, needing to be a little bit more cautious with the types of individual client representations you take. I also want to talk about the syllabus. You have to be explicit. You have to make sure that students understand what is being covered in this class, right? So I frame my course as using an entrepreneurial approach to justice, right? And so I'm very explicit that we'll cover topics that focus on like structural issues, including race. We talk about the racial wealth gap. We discuss these issues of class, pedigree, and elitism. And then we talk about the ways in which the government can be complicit, right? If you lay this out, and I cover this not only in the syllabus, but I have a little like asynchronous video that I force my students to watch that talks about like, this is going to be uncomfortable and it's okay to be uncomfortable, because you need to prime them so they're not caught off guard by it. So I also explicitly introduce these topics in seminar, and I use discussion questions. So my seminar, for example, in class, I do a really great class that's like I did at my previous institution, which was West Virginia University, that has a very different student population and client population than at, American University, where most of our clients are in the district, right? And we do an exercise on identifying barriers to access to capital, right? Like fundraising. So securities law, again, like very transactional, like very bread and butter, startups use the same things as like a mom and pop store, that's like trying to start a CSA, right, and survive the pandemic. So we do this whole class where we essentially talk about, actually, I must have missed a slide. Nope, sorry. We talk about this whole class where we talk about the structural nature of these problems and then applying those barriers to their client, right, or to their own like imaginary ventures, right, to really get them sort of immersed in and thinking about it. And I do two things. So this is where I want to weave in Alexi's second point on who we include, right? So there are a lot of great opportunities here to introduce your students to particularly Black women professors, right, who write in the spaces that you're covering, right? And so, so for example, for the racial wealth gap, Lenise Panton at Columbia has done so much, Julie Lawton has done a lot, Dana Thompson has done a lot, right? So like think about who you're introducing your students to, who they're going to pull on, right? So that's issue number one. And sort of like issue number two is, if there is a way to pull in a guest speaker into your seminar, this is also a great like continuation point. So like if we introduce this idea of, gaps in, the racial wealth gap, right? Is there then a way to sort of have a second class that talks to Black entrepreneurs in the district, right? Who are, dealing with rejection, with issues with banks, right, in a way that has been covered in the time. So think about how you can like build out your class. But again, like it helps also balance student expectations, because you're talking about a very brass tacks, substantive area of business law. Okay, so finally, I just want to end with this quote that I like speaks to me always, from Robin D.G. Kelley, which is that solidarity is not a market exchange, right? And in this context, it means, we have an obligation, right, to introduce our students to these topics, to address even what seems like the most strange, like out there topics to some of our doctrinal colleagues in terms of racial justice. We have an obligation, right, to engage in the solidarity work, but also this is a community of solidarity, right? So I'm going to send around a list of resources in addition to my slides that will be posted on the Google Drive that has some great, resources that have been created by the larger clinical community, readings, things like that. And that's a first step, but remember that we're always available, right? We were all once new clinicians. So, you should reach out to us to help navigate course design, to navigate cases, and to even navigate, like, can you help me think through what the pushback might be from my student population or my institution, and we can certainly step up and be there for you. So I really just want to end on that note. And I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Alexis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Priya and Lexi, for kicking us off. I wanted to start by saying, first, it's a pleasure to be with you all today, and also congratulations, because you're here at this conference because you're setting off on a new journey. Some of you are likely brand new entirely to clinical teaching. Some of you might already have experience but are transitioning to a new role. So yay for you, you did it, congrats. But whether you have experience or not, addressing race in a clinical setting may be new. And it's always a work in progress. I'm a person who went to law school because I wanted to be a racial justice lawyer. I wanted to work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And it's still hard. And I'll talk about that a little bit, in part for some of the reasons that Priya and Alexi have already discussed. But I mean, my hope today is really just to help stimulate your thinking about ways you might be able to bring in race in your course selection or your case selection or project selection. If you teach a course that's more focused on litigation, like mine. So first, I want to say that you can talk about race even if you're not bringing race claims in your work. And so let me share a little bit about my clinic just to provide a little context. So I teach the Constitutional Rights Clinic at Rutgers Law School in Newark. I've been there for about 5 years, and I should note I have enormous privilege. So my background today, which is very colorful and maybe a little distracting, sorry if it is actually a mural that we commissioned to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the law school's clinical program. And you might be able to see on there that there's a Black Lives Matter sign. There are pictures of Black people with their fists in the air, many of them in Newark itself. And that might give you a sense of kind of the place I'm coming from. And I recognize that, not everyone's institution is the same, that, our law school spent thousands of dollars to put up this mural in the hallway in our clinical suite. And so, Rutgers is a place where radical work is appreciated, talking about race is appreciated and supported. So I recognize that I enter this space with, some privilege in that regard. But that doesn't mean that the legal system has kept up with Rutgers Newark, and doesn't mean that it's always easy to address race in the work. And as Danny said in my intro, my clinic, we focus mostly on mass incarceration issues. And what that means, just in case you're not familiar with the term, is that we in the United States have the incredibly awful record of having roughly 2 million people incarcerated, another 2.5 million people under carceral control in some way or another, meaning probation or parole or some other form of community supervision. And it's a crisis that falls more heavily on communities of color, on Black and Latinx communities in particular. And so even though that's true, and some of you again might be more kind of familiar with the concept than others, it doesn't mean that it's easy to talk about when it comes to doing the work, when it comes to trying to enforce civil rights that are connected to our mass incarceration system. So I think it's unquestionably a race problem. I consider myself a racial justice lawyer, but I'm basically never litigating race-based claims. That said, I am trying to talk about it in class in all the ways that Alexi and Priya have suggested already, and trying to talk about it in the work when I can. So I wanted to give one example of a project that my clinic worked on where we were able to bring in race when it was really kind of being written out. And it was about the Newark Civilian Complaint Review Board. And a civilian complaint review board is basically an agency or an institution that aims to provide some civilian oversight for a police department. So when Newark's was created, it was lauded in the media nationally as perhaps the strongest CCRB in the country. And the city agreed to do it, but also had to do it because it ended up being a term of a consent decree that the city entered with the Justice Department Civil Rights Division after a 3-year investigation into unconstitutional police practices by the Newark Police Department. And as is so often the case with promising reforms in the world of policing, it was immediately challenged by local police unions. They had opposed it in the political realm. For decades, they had been able to hold off the creation of a CCRB. And then when it did actually get across the line, was really looking like it was a reality, they challenged it in court. And of course, we're talking about policing in the United States, and we're talking about policing in Newark, which is an overwhelmingly Black and brown city. So of course, race was at the heart of everything that was going on. It was the Black community largely that had been calling for the CCRB for decades. It was unconstitutional practices that were instituted against Black and brown people in the city. But somehow when we had this case about whether a CCRB should exist in Newark, it was just like race was totally out of the picture. It was all about really boring, arcane issues, like whether a state statute could allow the CCRB to have subpoena power, whether due process standards would allow the CCRB to consider complaints against police officers. I have to say that was some creative and convoluted lawyering done by the police union to come up with that theory. And also whether the state attorney general could bar the CCRB from accessing police department internal affairs files. So this case dragged on for years. The trial court ruled for the union and basically shut it down. The appellate division reversed. And then the case was getting to the New Jersey Supreme Court. And it, again, just felt like the narrative had become extremely sanitized about these really boring issues. And so there were dozens of pages of briefs, and really no one was talking about kind of the core issues of, why the CCRB needed to exist in Newark in the first place. What were the practices that led to its creation, and who had been asking for civilian oversight since roughly 1960, and why they had been doing it. And that was a story that was really 100% about race and about racism in policing in Newark. And so we wrote an amicus brief on behalf of the local chapter of the Urban League, and a Black activist who had been engaged in this call for civilian oversight for decades as well, to really kind of try to recenter the conversation. And obviously as an amicus, you only have so much influence. You don't really ever know, how much impact you're going to have. But we felt like it was really valuable to make sure that in all this talk about, Chapter 10A, Section 7B, 321, and whatever other boring statutory citation we could come up with, that we were really being honest about what was going on. And so it felt like a valuable way to talk about racial justice, to bring race into the conversation, even though, these were not race-based claims. We were not saying that the Newark Police Department was violating constitutional rights on the basis of race, which would be probably impossible. But we were able to, I think, again, kind of bring the conversation to race in a way that the litigants, I think, just really didn't want to do, probably for a variety of reasons. So I'll tell you, even though I really liked writing this brief and researching it with my students, where they obviously did the bulk of the labor, I will confess the case did not go the way we wanted it to, but it still felt like it was a valuable addition. And I like to think that, in light of George Floyd's killing, the protests last year that really have rocked the country, that we were adding something to the conversation to be real about, this is why people are in the street. This case was going on basically at exactly the same time. And we're not just talking about, random statutory provisions that no one cares about and no one reads. We're talking about real issues that are driving people to the streets in Newark, just like they are all over the country. So I guess I just say all that to say, there's a way to address racial justice, even if you're not bringing race claims. And you can talk about race when other people don't want to kind of recenter the conversation and make it, I think, just a little bit more honest. The other thing I wanted to share with you all is, I think, just the basic truth that, even though we're here today to give you some ideas and tips, it doesn't mean this is easy. For some of the reasons that Alexi and Priya have already talked about. Again, like I said, I have, I think, some relative privilege, being at a place where talking about race is valued, and I have colleagues who value it, but it's still a challenge. And I will say, for me as a Black woman in particular, I worry about being punished by students, as Priya suggested, on student evaluations, on, moving away from the core doctrine. But all that aside, I really recommend it. And in particular, in the last year at Rutgers Newark, we passed, I would like to think it's a pretty strong anti-racism statement that committed the faculty to doing a bunch of things. And we in the clinical faculty in Newark have taken it even farther. We did an anti-racism training. It was a very intense 5 days for a number of us. And since then, we've committed to get together to talk about race in our teaching, in our clinical teaching. And so now we're doing anti-racism rounds where we just talk about how race is showing up in our classes. And so, that could be, this thing happened in class and I want to talk about it. Or, some conversation with a client, it felt like there was kind of race was there in a way that I wasn't quite sure how to deal with. And so I guess I suggest all that to say, even if you don't have a critical mass of super rad colleagues like I do, I'm pretty sure you can find your people on your faculty. So please do. And the idea of making yourself talk about it is really valuable because it's very easy. Everybody's busy. You have a million things to do. It's very easy to just kind of like keep it moving. But I promise you, there's probably at least one person on your faculty who's your ally, who'd be willing to work through some of these issues with you. And I've been talking too long, so I'm gonna stop. Thank you.
So certainly not talking too loud. I could listen to the three of you for the rest of the day, and that would probably be better for everyone. So I'll start by just sort of naming how I feel right now. I feel really anxious. I've been experiencing an enormous amount of anxiety in general. It's been a very hard semester, a semester that has felt like it's had a lot of failure, a lot of not accomplishing the things that we're talking about. And so I wanted to start by owning the fact that remains a reality. And it will remain a reality for everyone here forever, that we don't necessarily get perfect at this, or even necessarily very good at this. Most of us are in institutions that are even worse at this. So I just wanted to say that I feel more like a new clinician than I did 12 years ago in a lot of ways. These are moments, days of sort of great possibility, days in which we have students come to us, some of us for the first time, who are legitimately interested in the same political and intellectual projects that we are engaged in. But also days when, we are forced to reckon with backlash, with death, with all sorts of really difficult things that we are often the only space that students have to process, as was discussed earlier. So I just want to, say I don't feel like an expert talking about this. And I'm mostly going to talk in terms of questions, questions that I ask myself periodically that I think are useful. And the first is a question that builds off of what Alexis just said. And that is, who are my people in this project? And I think a lot of us think that way generally. We're sort of aware of community. But when it comes to teaching in clinics, I think it can be useful to actually write down the names of who those people are going to be, right? So when you encounter difficult situations, when you're working through this work, who are the 3 or 4 people that I promise myself I'm going to reach out to talk about failure, success, difficulty, confusion. So if I were going to ask folks today to do anything, I would ask you to jot down the names, and they don't have to be the people that have been thrust upon you as mentors by your institution. And oftentimes it's better if they are not. So then the next question that I periodically try to ask myself, and I assume that most of us see our work as racial justice work on one level or another. If not, I hope that you take a moment to think about how your work is racial justice work. But I like to ask myself, how is it racial justice work? And why is it racial justice work? And I think for a lot of us, the answer is going to be personal first. For a lot of us, it will also be a political answer, right? And for some of us, myself not, but for many of you, it might be a spiritual answer. And so being, sort of open with yourself about where you come from in this work, what spaces you come out of, and why you're doing racial justice work is I think very, very important. So if I were going to ask you to ask any other question, it would be that. So I think we all have this ideal, or many of us have this ideal, that we will run a clinic this way, right? We will introduce through guest speakers and through written materials the ideas that are necessary to give us and the students a common language to discuss the work that we're doing in clinic, right, through the analytic lens of race. And that we will then use the cases, right, much as Priya discussed, to have important conversations, right, whether the claims themselves, as Alexis said, are race-based claims or not, and to tie our work to movements, right, and to intellectual ideas that are all around us in this country. And the semester will just progress with that happening. I have never successfully had a semester where that is what transpired. And there may be faculty members who have. So I'm not saying that other people have not. But the realities of litigation or transactional work or policy work often involve running from one emergency to another emergency. So that means that you have to have a kind of operational approach. And for those of us who are dreamers and who want to blow up this world and create a new one, operational approaches don't necessarily come easily. So that means actually saying to yourself, how much time do I promise myself I'm going to carve out for these conversations? And how many of these conversations are realistic? And when I say realistic, I mean how many of these conversations can I see all the way through, right? Because there is real danger in introducing these topics and not finishing, right? And the danger is students. The danger is what we do to students. So I have a few prompts that I use, and they're part of another PowerPoint that I use, and I'll just share them. So what will the impact of this intervention be on students of color? This thing that I'm saying. What position am I putting them in? Do they want to be in that position? Am I anticipating relying on students of color agreeing with me and agreeing with each other? Have I adequately prepared to handle the pushback? And we all know what I mean by pushback. That may threaten to derail this intervention, right? And potentially hurt those students. Am I prepared to see this all the way through so that the message to the students is that racial justice, anti-racism is fundamental to the project of the course, all right? And so what I would encourage, and I've never known a new clinician that successfully did this, so I'm encouraging something that I believe is impossible, right? Is I would encourage you to pick 2 or 3 things to start and see them all the way through. And that may mean that a case, an instance is introduced in rounds, and you then talk about that for 4 weeks because it's that complicated and it's that nuanced, and it requires, that you pick up an extra reading in order to really get your mind around it. So in some ways, I'm advocating doing less and really taking your time with it. I think there are real dangers in trying to do too much. And I speak from experience, having attempted to do too much and failed. So another thing that I think is important, so all of these great things are happening in the country. When I say great things, I don't mean in the White House or elsewhere, but I mean organizers, activists, movements are exploding around us. It's beautiful, it's exciting. Embrace that hope, right? But historicize, right? And what I mean by that is make sure that students know that the work that they're engaged in, right? Not just the ideas, but the work itself, the lawyering itself has a long history, right? And so if you don't know what the history of your own work is, that's impossible. And so that's some homework, right? Like, who did this work before me, right? If I can't find out about things about them, one of the things that I've added to my clinic is I have students attempt to recover narratives of radical Black women lawyers from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and they have to actually present, right? These are the folks who got written out, right? When we come to law school and we look for heroes, how many heroes are sort of available? 3 or 4, we could all probably name them in our heads. Let's recover the other hundreds, right? So historicize, make sure that people know that the work is a part of a long tradition of work. And the other benefit of historicizing, right, of sort of saying this racial justice work didn't appear out of nowhere, is that it does become a way that you can insert hope, right? And hope is really, really, really important, right? We've all had victories and victories feel great, but this past year was not a year of victories, right? And students feel that. And as as we teach students, most of the things that we teach them are depressing. And so adding an alternative history, a history of hope, is very, very, very important. So none of that is very helpful probably to any of you, but I wanted to just sort of advocate for trying to do a little bit less as well as we can do it. So that's all. And I think we're going to questions. We got plenty of time, right?
That's right. So Danny, I think we'll turn it over to you to manage the Q&A. Thank you for those great remarks, Brandon. And I want to shout out my fellow panelists because we're all pandemic parenting in addition to pandemic clinicking. And we're all still standing, or at least like I'm sitting in a high chair, but it counts,
Thank you all for a fantastic presentation. There is good time for questions, so please put them in the chat. I will just reiterate what has been now placed in the chat a couple of times. I don't know if all of you saw in real time the many requests that you were getting over and over again for materials to be shared. So we intend to follow up and make sure these presenters share their slides and syllabi, other materials, exercises. We will post them to the Google Drive. So in case you didn't see it over and over again, but open it up for questions. You don't need to put it in the chat if you want to come off mute at this point. Here's a question from Tommy Landers, and Tommy, you're asking here, what has not worked well, and how would you have done it differently? Always a good question.
I'll jump in quickly. So I mentioned that my clinic is now fairly focused on mass incarceration issues, but that was not always the case. And, with a clinic called the Constitutional Rights Clinic, and having, luckily, freedom to direct it in any way I see fit, I don't have to respond to really the administration or the faculty or donors, about case selection or project selection. I realize that particularly when it comes to wanting to talk about race and wanting to address race, that initially I think some of the topics were kind of like too far afield. And even though kind of like I love that, before I came to Rutgers, I was a lawyer at the New York affiliate of the ACLU. And, my favorite part about that job was getting to work on a bunch of different things. That's really hard to conquer in a semester with 2 L's and 3 L's too. And so I've realized that for me, kind of narrowing at least a little bit the subject matter has been helpful to kind of direct the conversations and to, be able to focus. So, like I think Alexi mentioned talking about abolition and reform efforts. And so, because my clinic is now fairly focused on mass incarceration, I can do that in a way that I couldn't when we were also doing voting rights projects. And even though, as my favorite law school professor used to say, don't you see how the law is a seamless web? And she's right, there are connections everywhere, but it's harder to do when you only have 14 weeks. And so I think, attempting to kind of at least a little bit kind of narrow the subject matter has helped in facilitating these conversations.
Brendan, there's a question for you that is from Sue Schechter here. Can you talk more about issues, or for the panel, that Brendan raised about students of color in the clinic, externship courses, and raising these critical issues? And Sue, please come off mute and elaborate if I'm presenting it wrong.
No, I would love to hear the other panelists talk about it as well.
So I can say I'm very heavy-handed with trying to create space for students of color. So specifically, if we have, and I gotta say, I have the advantage of whenever I have not taught by myself, having exclusively only taught with another clinician of color, so there's like an automatic power differential that comes into the classroom. But one of the things I do is if we are talking about racial justice, we will start in small groups first and then come back to the class. And I very much intentionally designed those small groups in a way for students of color to feel like very, like essentially like secure and safe, and in order to be able to have like very honest discussions and then feel empowered when we come back to the group to push back or recalibrate. And that's also why I assign discussion questions to get people who might be, not thinking about these issues explicitly to have to think about them, because I don't just assign the discussion questions, they have to turn them in for points. So it's like, you need to fill this out and we're going to engage in discussion. And that's part of the grading rubric. I think that as intentional and controlled as you can be, that's key to being able to create space and protect students of color.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing on that. I found the individual engagement and the personal reflection to seem even safer for students of color than when they're in a group setting. So I totally agree with like trying to create very controlled group settings, but I'm also very mindful of participation grades, right? Which of course is a part of clinician work, but like, I'm not dinging the student of color who's not maybe raising their voice in that discussion if they're being really thoughtful in their personal reflection, because they might feel much more comfortable doing that with me as a fellow person of color versus doing this in a classroom in our predominantly white institution, which is frankly the makeup of most law schools across the country, right? So I think we need to be flexible as to how we assess students as well, knowing that everyone's kind of coming with different layers, right, to these spaces.
Bridget Ortega asks about, or for some suggestions for those of us in the South, I include myself in this, where there is a real divide between white and Black philosophy and mindset. Of course, there are other parts of the country not excluded from this, but suggestions that you, the panelists, have?
I hate to talk this much, but having taught in West Virginia, which like part of it is the South, right? But certainly it is. I mean, it has like great biscuits. So does that qualify? So it's a conservative space, and this is where I think a lot of this is where like solidarity, I think like keeping the solidarity and intersectionality mindset really comes into place, because when you work in a setting where it is rural, folks who are rural and folks who are people of color often have a lot of commonality in terms of which this legal web that Alexis referenced has really created a system of subordination, right? So it's sort of like staging it, right? To say, these folks are left out, you're left out. Guess what? There's also a lot of folks who are people of color, specifically Black folks, Latino folks who are rural, who are left out. And this is the way that all of that, right, ends up making it possible for some kid who, went to NYU, my alma mater, right, and is from Austin, Texas, to be able to bootstrap the world's dumbest startup, right, while you can't get a loan to start like a really important daycare business in your town, right, that could provide essential care during a pandemic. So, there are opportunities to think about how can I build solidarity in a conversation, and it's not one class, right? It will take the whole semester before you can get someone there, and that's why it's important to pick what, like Brendan said, pick one topic, set that reasonable goal, see if you can make someone care.
A couple of our attendees, Chipo, am I pronouncing your name correctly? I want to make sure I get it right.
Yes, you are.
Okay, about asking, how do you not center whiteness and privilege?
Would you mind expanding just a little bit so that?
So many of these conversations are structured around how do we deal with, white fragility? How do we deal with white privilege? Which then determines and dictates the tone and how far we go in these conversations. And particularly with our, our students, because then there's always the the pushback, oh, academic freedom. There's always the pushback, what about our more quote unquote conservative students? And so it is, how do you, what tools do you, and how do you frame, okay, this is how we're going into the conversation. I mean, there's a couple of ways that I do it, but I'd like many, many more. So because that pushback and that resistance comes in and manifests in so many subtle, direct and subtle ways.
I don't have it's such an important and also heavy and complex question, right? So I can't speak for my fellow panelists, but I would imagine that many of the strategies we talked about, we think are not necessarily uprooting, right, all things structural oppression, but are contributing to the chip, right, chipping away at the way people think. But I think the one thing that's important is to, maybe that hasn't been mentioned, is to be really honest about the law and the law's purpose, and that and what the law has done. And Brendan spoke a little bit about this in terms of history. I think, in my mind, the law has been used to oppress versus liberate, right, throughout our history. And I think that's hard for students who are now aspiring to be lawyers, right, to digest. But I think that's because law is rooted in white supremacy as well, right, just like many other institutions and policies and practices within our country and the world. So, but I'm pretty I think I'm pretty explicit about that stuff, and I'm pretty explicit about it in writing. And that might deter some students from me personally, or deter some students from my courses. And I've kind of okay with that, right? Because I'm like, you know what, if you don't want to subscribe to this, okay, I know the law is going to, lawyering brings in many different people, but I'm not going to change my philosophy or framework to have you feel like you can participate and this is aligned with your ideas. And maybe that sounds really awful, but in some ways that's a little bit of a quasi-privilege we have in the clinical world, and that our job is not only to teach Black letter law, which I don't think exists anyway, but we don't have that pressure. I think that to some extent we have, we are able to respond to current events, to client needs, et cetera, which allows us, I think, to hopefully forces us, right, to bring a more comprehensive and historical perspective. Arguably, one should do that in any doctrinal class too, but I think there is maybe more room to do it here. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say I'm unapologetically, I'm a woman of color. I'm unapologetically, I'm a former movement lawyer. This is who I am. To be clear, to Priya's point earlier, do I think this can ding me on an evaluation? 100%, right? I think it definitely can. And I think that is a risk, right? For anyone who's not tenured. I think that's a risk for long-term contract faculty, all those things, right? That is so true. But I think for me, I've decided that I guess I'm going to take that risk because it will feel worse, right? If I am acquiescing to the one conservative student in the class, or that, I don't know. I don't know if I've answered the question well, but I'm just I'm unapologetically Black, right? I'm unapologetically a movement lawyer, et cetera. And that's who I am, So I don't know if that helps, but that's sort of the framework I've taken.
I would say I'm more confirmed because I am more the, like I said, the straight up, it's I'm not going to be doing this. I'm not going to be doing that. And this is an equal conversation. So I'm kind of straight up. So yeah. So it confirms, it affirms it. So sorry, Alexis.
Oh, no. Yeah, I would just basically say almost exactly what Alexi said. I mentioned my kind of institutional privilege, about kind of the culture at Rutgers, Newark. And I actually have been kind of pleasantly surprised that it hasn't really been as much of an issue as I thought it might be, because it turns out that I like to say that I have a despised persons docket, because I tend to represent people who, they're not exactly popular people, like people who are on a sex offender registry or something like that. And so I've had it happen that, I have students show up for the first day and we talk about the docket and, what the projects are, and we go over the syllabus, and sometimes people don't come back. And so I think by setting, and that's okay, if they're going to be miserable, spending a semester, going to visit clients who are in prison or on parole or, whatever, then I think it's probably better that they don't take the clinic because they're going to be unhappy about it. And so the case selection kind of does some of that work. And so even though, I mentioned, being concerned about it, and obviously several of us have mentioned student evaluations and concerns about that, It hasn't actually, even though it's there as an existential fear, it hasn't actually been a huge problem for me, because students know what they're signing up for. They know I worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They know that I worked at the New York Civil Liberties Union. You know, they can talk to students about the briefs that they write in my clinic and the cases that they take. And yeah, it's working okay. Fingers crossed for next semester.
I'm going to jump in quickly with just one other suggestion, which is kind of tying into the question about if you're at a more conservative geography, or you're worried about a state school that has a crazy state legislature, right, which seems to be in vogue right now, that you can, there are resources actually on your main campus. Like there's usually like a Center for Learning and Teaching, you know, that has a lot of like great resources, be it like, you know, short guides or short videos or like workshops that they can provide for you that can like help you navigate it within your specific institution. So that's also something that you should consider leveraging and relying on, especially during this like quote unquote fallow period between the one clinic ending and another clinic semester beginning.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Lexi, there's one directed to you that is, I think, specific to the externship context and relates back to the exercising you have your students do that engages the field supervisor outside of the law school setting, and what sort of reporting back your students do on those dialogues, what you require as far as the follow-up there.
Yeah, sure. I've done a couple of different options. So we do discussion blogs where everyone can, you know, gets the benefit of seeing the feedback. I do personal journals, right? I mean, none of these are sort of rocket science strategies, but I think what I ask them to do is report back on the discussion, and then also like, what is their gut reaction? Do they differ from their supervisor? And how are they the same? What might be reasons why they have a different opinion? And that's, I think, can bring up the experiences they had, their identity, right? Their age, you know, all the different factors, right? That make us think about who we are and how we function. So I think getting, you know, forcing students to engage with their supervisors about a range of topics is just really important, right? Because it can very much be an assignment and do the assignment and that's it. And I think that's not the full benefit, I think, of the externship world. So I you know, whether it's this topic or any other topic, I would just strongly encourage that philosophy. And then the output can just be done in many, many different ways, I think, group, personal, et cetera. I've also before gathered the responses and then like mixed them up and had people be like, what if your supervisor said this, right? So they can think about, you know, what they have versus what the other student had. So there's not like an identity attached to it. That can be valuable too.
I want to get all these questions. We're not going to get all of them. I apologize. I know, Priya, you mentioned, I think you were referring to Chrissy's question in the chat about what do we do with this newest layer of the challenge, where for some of us in states where there is at the highest levels of legislature and government specific pronouncements against, right, teaching race, systemic racism. I mean, in so many different forms now. What advice do you have for addressing those, in particular those of us at state schools, but really across the board, folks teaching and working with students in these states?
I'm going to give a very lawyer answer. Everything is on an email, right? Even transactional lawyers know about discovery. So like, you want to keep a record. Second, there are advocates, as Brendan and everyone else has mentioned. Find them, build a relationship with them, right? Get on Signal, make sure they're on Signal, text confidentially if you need to, right, to address an issue. And then honestly, like, make sure you're just like leveraging all of the resources that are available to you to CYA. You know, I think it's really important to sort of lawyer. I mean, if you're going to be reckless, you better be a lawyer, you know? So think like a lawyer, not like a prof.
Okay, one more.
I don't really have much useful to say. I just wanted to say, as someone who's at a state school, but luckily not in a state where anything awful like that is happening, I want to thank you for raising that issue, whoever did, and I wish I was better able to respond to it, because it is something that I think, we as a clinical community need to take extremely seriously. And maybe it's a good topic for a clinical conference panel next year. So since we're right on the cutting edge with this, we don't have ready answers, but I just want to thank you for raising it up.
Just a last question, one that I know cannot be answered in the couple of minutes we have left, but Brittany Wilson asks about being explicit about race and syllabi course materials, but how do you address and or incorporate race, racism, power dynamics, et cetera, in interpersonal interactions between students and attorney supervisors or case team members?
Well, I'll just say again, another really good question that I think doesn't necessarily have a clear answer. I mentioned that at Rutgers, we're doing these kind of regular meetings to talk about race and clinical teaching, and it is a topic that certainly has come up. I find it really, really hard to offer any advice on this because I think it's so context dependent. I'm sorry to be the annoying lawyer who's like, well, it depends. But I think it really kind of does depend on the details and the students, whether you're talking about clients, I think as a professor, your own racial identity could play a role in how these things play out. So yeah, I have no good answer. I'm sorry. But I again, thank you for raising it because it's something that we all need to think about and work through more.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And one thing that has come up a lot is like, even how students are working with each other, right? And who's doing what. And I do think there can be ways to force teams to articulate in writing whose roles is what is, so you can ensure, for example, that the female students or the women, the people of color aren't like doing certain assignments, right? Whereas because the default may be that, right? Just even if people aren't intentionally doing that. So I think forcing people to name the roles, right? And to, I think, then see if there are patterns, right, that are resulting, I think is important. I also think we've used a couple times the restorative justice, like actual, like the DU has restorative practitioners, not necessarily in law school, but broadly to sort of say that we need help working in teams, right? Because working in a team and collaborating is a skill, right? So I think we need to help students learn how to write and talk to the clients too. We also need to help them learn how to work with each other. So I think maybe my best answer to that is not ignoring it, right? And actually making sure that's part of the syllabi, part of the curriculum, where there's self-assessment, but there's also team building activities, and there's spaces for students to then share how they think their teams are working or not. Because I think if you can get that information, you can potentially see, do there seem to be disproportionality here? Are there negative interactions? And then do you need to bring in outside experts, right? Especially depending on your identity, depending on your experience, et cetera. So I think just making sure it's raised and it's part of one of the learning objectives, I think that's really critical.
Well, I just want to thank all of our presenters this morning. Priya texted me to let me know that her computer died. So she says thank you and goodbye to everybody. And I made sure to thank her. Thank you, Alexis, Alexi, and Brendan, just for a truly excellent presentation. So many good suggestions, and just for lifting us all up this morning. We appreciate it. All the time you put in. Thank you. I want just a couple of reminders to everybody. We're going to go to small group at 12:45. So make sure you transition there. You should have the links from yesterday. If you don't, let's put Lisa's email in the chat just to make sure that you all can reach out. Reminder that tomorrow, in lieu of plenary sessions, we're going to have concurrent sessions tomorrow and Thursday. So please take a look over the program, make a decision about which of the excellent concurrents you're going to attend. The links are in the program. And again, we are going to post materials as we go on the Google Drive. We hope you will check it out. We're going to be posting recordings of these sessions both on cliaweb.org and on CLIA's YouTube page, more information to come. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Have wonderful small groups, and we will see you tomorrow.